working there?
No, it was a fundraiser
Oh, really?
for a politician.
Acha, acha.
But I thought I was doing Islam a service. So we
Why
tried to
not?
convince her that Muslims are also participants.
Yes, yes, yes.
How was it? Good gathering?
Yes, it was big, yes. We got, you know who came? Yasir and his wife came also. I was impressed. And I told them about this nice lecture. So they said they'll start coming.
अच्छा चलो इंशाल्लाह. It's new technology I'm trying today. Hmm?
You don't look so nice with this sticking out.
Oh, thank you. So that's so kind, doctor. Thank you very much.
No, it doesn't show.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I'm waiting for the green light for his video, I think, which is. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Iqbal bhai, what's his name? He's got that screen there, no? Sorry. وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Is it? No, but the camera? Oh well. Oh, okay, fine. Right. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I seek refuge with Allah from Satan the accursed. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All glory and praise belongs to Allah, whose blessings cannot be counted by the counters, whose adequate homage cannot be paid by the worshippers. Words cannot describe him. Salawat. You can hear me? All right? Yeah. Okay. So none can fully. Okay. So none can fully understand him. Reason cannot visualize him. Human faculties of conception, perception, and intuition cannot fathom the extent of his majesty. There was no time when he didn't exist, and there will not be any duration without his existence. He created the universe with his omnipotence, and he knew the details of everything before he brought it into existence. I testify that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the servant and prophet of God. Almighty God has placed his trust in Muhammad and Ali Muhammad because they are the group who protect his commands and who spread and explain his message. With those powerful words of the successor to our Prophet, our first Imam, my elders, my brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are continuing with my theme. We are trying to meet the expectations of God by following the conduct and the life lessons of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are trying to strengthen our connection with God. And the fundamental verse that I've used in my speeches is from Surah Ahzab. You have indeed in the Messenger an excellent model for those of you who have hope in God and in the last day, and who remember God frequently. So tonight I want to concentrate on the Prophet's role as a family man. Now we know that the family is a building unit of any community and therefore society. The health and well-being of a family affects the health and well-being of the society. If we look, just slightly digressing, if we look at the Western world, right up to the 1980s, there was, at least in the UK, a sense of community and society until Margaret Thatcher arrived on the scene, and probably coincided with Ronald Reagan in the US, where the individual was placed as the primary mover, and that kind of unleashed a different kind of economic path where, at least speaking for the UK, the society has somewhat diminished. It's very much a dog-eat-dog, inequality of income, generally deterioration in community relations. It's a different, not the theme of my talk, but that has also coincided. Up until that time, some commentators think that Muslims and Islam were not really focused upon. It's when society and these community values diluted and dissipated that they needed to find a community to target. But anyway, that is not the subject of my talk. The society in the Prophet's days was obviously tribal, clan-based, and there were further divisions into sub-clans. The Banu, the prefix Banu, meant a sub-clan. So the Banu Hashim meant the clan of the Hashim, or the Banu Umayyah meant the clan of Umayyah. It was a primitive and a traditional society. Very few people were educated. There were a few, most of them were polytheists, but there were a few monotheists known as Hanifs, who were the descendants of Hazrat Ibrahim and Hazrat Ismail. Daughters were an embarrassment to people in those days, and in some cases they were hidden, and in some cases buried alive. Now, according to psychologists, people's character and thinking is an outcome of the environment that they live in. There's a general principle of harmony which causes society to follow the dominant practices, the dominant culture. So, for example, in our current society now, we have the predomination of social media, we have the celebrity culture, we have reality TV, we have sports celebrities that are followed, etc., etc. In fact, there was a recent survey done in Europe which concluded that a quarter of youngsters are apparently happy online rather than interacting with other human beings. And it's horrible to think what the implications of that could be, where you don't have the warmth. You almost need a reality check, because people online can make all kinds of identities and they could get removed from reality. But coming back to the Prophet, let's look at the Prophet's role as a husband, as a father, and a brother. So if I start off with his role as a husband, I think we all know the story of the Prophet's marriage to Bibi Khadija, but it may be worth just recalling that. That in his youth, after his shepherd days had gone, he became a caravan trader, and very quickly developed a very good reputation in that business. And therefore he was hired by the lady called Khatija bint Khuwailid, one of the wealthiest women of Mecca. And she engaged him on a mission to Syria. And in that mission, which, in those days, these caravan missions could have up to 100 camels. So you had to be pretty organized. You had to have the camel riders. You needed to load the stock up. You needed to make sure that the path was secure, etc., etc. So Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma salli ala, did all those tasks to a high level and made Bibi Khadija a handsome profit. Now she was obviously very impressed, and the feedback she received was that he was very organized and handled the people that worked with him very well. So following those reports, the Bibi then sounded out, used one of her contacts to sound out whether there was any interest from a marriage perspective from the Prophet. And when her contact came back and said, yes, there was, then she actually sent a proposal to him, which probably was a first in those days, probably pretty uncommon even now. Now, according to some tradition reports, and this is the most common knowledge, was that Bibi was 40 years old. But there was one report, or more than one report that I've come on, one from a well-known narrator, Abdullah ibn Masud, which mentions that she was 28 years old, which seems likely because she then had 6 children. She bore 6 children to the Prophet. Not all of them survived, as we know. And the Prophet was to remain married to Bibi Khadija for 25 years, and during this time, she was his only wife. And in this period, he went from a trader to a seeker of truth through his spells of meditation in the cave Hira on the mountain. But in respect of how he was with his wife, some of you may have heard of this author, Tariq Ramadan. He's a professor of Islam in Switzerland. He's written a book about the Messenger of God, and in that book he says that the Prophet used to turn to his wife for comfort, particularly after the experience of the first revelation. And she was the first person to accept Islam. And throughout the first 10 years of his mission, she was by his side. The Prophet loved her dearly, and as I said before, she bore him 6 children. Now, again, I covered that in Arab society, daughters were seen as a shameful thing, but the Prophet and Bibi Khadija surrounded their daughters with deep love, care, and didn't hesitate to express that in public. The Holy Prophet consulted the Bibi, listened to her views, and she was present when the revelations occurred, and by his side when the Prophet used to convey the message of the revelations. Bibi Khadija, and indeed the other wives of the Prophet, were active in public life. They never confused modesty as being cut off from society or from social, political, economic, and even the military sphere. Well, contrast that with some of the misogynistic views of parts of the Arab world or parts of the Muslim world now. Not everywhere, but I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the famous treatment that was meted out to Malala Yousafzai by the Taliban, who didn't want girls to be educated. And of course, now she's been honored with a Nobel Prize. But it's not everywhere like that. I mean, people who've been to Malaysia have seen that women operate as co-equals in Malaysian society. They do the hijab, but they are very much active in the economic life of the country. And if you travel anywhere, they drive, they ride motorbikes, etc., etc. Now, the Prophet used to allow his wife to ask questions, and used to give reasons behind some of the choices he made. His attitude to housework was also something to learn from. He helped Bibi in the housework. He used to sew his own clothes. He used to repair his own shoes. And they lived very modestly. Often he would only have some dates in the house, nothing else. Any of the gifts that the Prophet received were immediately given out to the poor, and if he received any slaves as gifts, they were freed straight away. The Prophet was also very approachable, which is a very important thing for a leader, to stay in touch with his followers. And he owned very little, and he allowed himself to be questioned by women, by children, even by slaves. He lived among the poor without any kind of grand residence. His house was just as simple as anybody down the street. If he came into a room, if people were already there, he would just make himself comfortable in just one corner of the room. He wouldn't expect people to make space for him and so on. So through these kind of actions and attitudes, the Holy Prophet was reforming the customs and practice of that time. There's a small story about Umar ibn Khattab, who was having a conversation with his wife. And in an argument, she answered him back. And of course, he had remonstrated with her. And she said, look, our daughter Hafsa argues and discusses things with the Prophet, and he allows it. And Umar then went and checked with his daughter, who confirmed that she was allowed to freely express her views and opinions. And the Prophet had accustomed his wives to attention, a dialogue, listened to their suggestions, and had a respectful attitude to them. So among the Prophet's children, Bibi Fatima, obviously, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, was very close to him, and like his father, used to serve the poor. There were a group of people who used to live around the Prophet's house called the Ahl al-Sufa, or people of the bench. These were the poorest of the poor, and there were some benches around the Prophet's house where they used to spend their time. So at home or in public, when Bibi Fatima came into the room, the Prophet would stand up, publicly showing his respect and affection, in contrast to the prevailing customs of those times. He would kiss the Bibi, he would talk to her, he would confide in her, and have her sit by her side, whilst ignoring remarks from companions. He also used to play with his grandsons, and once, I think it was Imam Hassan who was on his back when he was in sajda. He prolonged the sajda until the Imam came off his back. So through these examples, with the family members, the Prophet taught good manners, kindness and gentleness, respect for children, and regard and attentiveness towards women. As I said yesterday and the day before, he would say, I have been sent to perfect the noble manners, the makarimul akhlaq. Another example of his dealing with family issues stands out. Once Bibi Fatima and her husband Imam Ali alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala, needed some help. The Bibi had young children and said to the Imam that I could do with another slave to help with the housework and so on. And Imam Ali suggested to her, let's go and talk to your father and see whether we can secure some help. So when they went and met the Prophet, he listened to them. But after listening to them, he said, the Ahl al-Sufa, these people of the bench, they are worse off than you, and any help that I can give, I need to give it to them. So you need to endure and be patient. So the lesson imparted was that though she was his daughter, he was his cousin and son-in-law, there was no family privilege allowed in terms of the Prophet giving them any kind of privilege. And late that evening, the Prophet went to Imam Ali's and Bibi Fatma's house, and he said, "Shall I offer you something better than what you asked for?" And of course they said yes. And he said, "These words have been brought down by Jibreel." And those were the words which later became the Tasbiyatul Fatima. Everyone knows that, which all Muslims now recite after their prayers. So the Prophet answered his daughter's material request with something granting her almost a privilege of a confidence from God Himself. So what can we learn further from the Prophet's behavior with his wife and children, which is relevant to our lives in current times? I want to focus on three aspects that a husband and a father can practice. The first one is the need to listen attentively and sincerely. Second, to communicate effectively and to respect points of views. And third is to show love and affection. Now, to show the importance of this listening attentively, I've got a little personal anecdote which is quite illustrative of what happens. So this was an incident that happened, I don't know whether people follow cricket here, but there was an England-India series of cricket matches recently, and on a Saturday morning, me and my wife were sitting face to face having some breakfast, but over her shoulder I could peek and look at the TV screen. Now she had some issue to discuss, and I was trying to listen to her as well as keeping an eye on the cricket match. And then of course a wicket fell, and Mahendra Singh Dhoni, the Indian captain, walked in. And as people know, Dhoni can be a hard hitter of the ball. And before I knew it, I saw my wife very upset, and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, you're clearly not listening." And then the conversation completely switched to how rude I was. And then, to pretend to listen, but not really listening. And then the entire day was affected. When we sort of tried to reconnect, she said, "Look, I'm home all day, and I need an adult conversation from time to time, and you are supposed to listen to me, and yet you weren't." So the reflection I had from that was that we can sometimes be into ourselves, into our own thinking, into our own world. We simply do not listen. So listening with complete attention is just as relevant today as it was in the time of the Prophet. The second aspect I stated was the communication part. Communicate effectively. Now, in the current times, I think there is an issue when it comes to communicating between parents and children, particularly teenagers, and I've been through that myself. Now, there are a number of issues. Parents and children have a responsibility to treat each other with respect and consideration. As parents, we can express our thoughts even if they are unpopular. And as parents, we have the responsibility for taking decisions in the households, because obviously we are the adults. But when it comes to teenagers, we have to deal with issues which are a product of our culture. I mentioned before, celebrity issues, inappropriate use of social media, alcohol, substance abuse, the list can go on. But in following the Prophet's example and projecting that to today's period, we need to bear in mind certain principles. Parents should really listen to teenagers' point of view and realize that there is a generational and a cultural gap. Particularly as first-generation immigrants who may have grown up in the subcontinent or other parts of the world, the values that we were taught by our parents, or the values that we picked up from society there, are obviously very different from the values that the children born and brought up in the West are. So we need to allow for that. And we need to aim at a relationship which, with teenagers at least, should be that of a valued friend, not something you possess to control. Children and teenagers, their reactions and their responses are part of their own record, own life record. As a Muslim parent, the duty for us is to let them realize this and let them take responsibility for their own thoughts and actions. The other comment I wanted to make here was partly controversial, but nevertheless I will say it, is that we, as parents, sometimes they tend to be more tolerant of sons rather than daughters. We almost have a double standard. I've been guilty of this myself. So you have a cut-off period when your daughter should be back home, and sometimes you may not have that kind of rule applying to your daughters. Also, in some households, the women end up doing all the work, from the cooking to the washing to the cleaning and everything. And many a Muslim mother wouldn't speak up if her husband is sitting around not following the Prophet's example in terms of helping with the household work and setting a bad example to the sons and to the children. The Prophet never treated his wives in that way. He was always helpful, always appreciative. But unfortunately, a later generation of chauvinistic men did not learn that from the Prophet's life. So I'm sure there are different schools on parenting. I'm sure there are lots of books that people read on parenting. But as a parent myself of 3 young adults, in my opinion, my humble opinion, there are 3 key things that parents can do, which are important from a behavioral point of view. One is to establish a firm foundation of fairness and establish responsibility and rights for parents and for children. Praise and appreciate everything where children make an effort, so their good side is encouraged. And then the third issue I said was to show genuine love and affection to your wife and to your children. We can overcome many of the difficulties by following the Prophet's example. Modern families have many challenges, but where members put love and affection for each other first, they have a better chance of helping the next generation mature. Now, you may have heard of this before, but one way of looking at love is looking at it as a verb. Means love, the feeling, is the result of loving actions. So families where relationships may have gone stale could start by being courteous to each other. As a father, we need to give time and listen to children, have an open communication on all issues, show love and confidence in them, but set boundaries too. And show by example, by our own honesty, humbleness, our own prayers, and so on. And as a husband, we focus on communication, mutual respect, and of course, the love and affection that I talked about. Modern couples face a number of challenges. Both sometimes could be working. Some may even be continuing their education. I remember when I was training as an accountant, I was in a full-time job, and I couldn't study at home. So I used to go from work to a library, work there till 10 o'clock, and then come home. And my dear understanding wife would wait for me for dinner, because she recognized that this was in the interest of the family. So as a brother, again, the relationship as shown by the Prophet for Imam Ali alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, was, was, was based on love. And the guiding principle, I think, there is to love for your brother what you love for yourself. So now, brothers and sisters, turning to tonight's Karbala value. We've done two so far: covenant and responsibility, intolerance to oppression, that was last night, and tonight's value is dignity or izzat. In the Quran, Holy Quran, God says, dignity is only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His messenger and the believers. Surah Munafiqun, verse number 8. Therefore, the real source of dignity is only God. And as we know, God also says in Surah Ahzab that He's kept the Prophet's family away from pollution and impurities. So hence Imam Hussein, although he knew he would be martyred and his body would be disrespected, he never appealed to his enemies to respect his body. The Imam said, I have left in the way of God, and that God Himself will give dignity to me and my family. Those who are themselves not dignified, you cannot expect any dignity from them. Now in Karbala, the Imam showed that the path to dignity is to fight versus unjust authority and oppression, whereas the path of humility was the comfort and luxury taken by the Kufans. The people of Kufa, when they were threatened by Ibn Ziyad and their lives were in danger, they betrayed Hazrat Muslim and tried to protect their false dignity. The Imam made clear that they in fact were humiliated by sitting at home as cowards. So, in terms of the historic aspect of Karbala, which we've been discussing over the last 3 nights, last night was the point where the Imam had arrived in Karbala, and tonight I want to continue from that, when Ibn Ziyad and his commander, Umar ibn Sa'd, ibn Waqqas, and I'll tell you why I've used the word Waqqas there. He arrived from Kufa on the morning of 3rd Muharram with 4,000 soldiers. Now, Umar ibn Sa'd had been promised the governorship of Ray, which is a province in Persia, if he was to carry out Ibn Ziyad's instructions against Imam Hussein. Umar ibn Sa'd clearly had a choice: the reward in the world versus martyrdom. And he decided that joining the truthful was a distant advantage, whereas Ray symbolized an immediate gain, an immediate profit. Umar's father, Sa'd ibn Waqqas, was the man who had asked Imam Ali the question, how many hair have I got in my head? And the Imam had said to him at the time, I could answer that question, but how will you verify it? But then the Imam told him at the time that your son is going to be the murderer of my son. And I'm sure his father must have narrated that to Umar ibn Sa'd, but he chose to ignore it. So Umar ibn Sa'd instructed his messenger to go to Imam Hussein and ask him what his intentions were, why he was here. And the Imam replied that people of your town invited me, which is why I'm here. And if they are now averse to my presence, I will leave. When the messenger relayed that message back to Umar ibn Sa'd, he relayed that to Ibn Ziyad, the governor at Kufa. And then Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad wrote to Umar, saying, I've received your letter. Offer Imam Hussein and his followers the opportunity to pledge allegiance to Yazid. If they do so, we will decide what my decree will be. So that night there was a long meeting between Umar ibn Saad and Imam Hussein. Abu Mikhnaf, the historian who I've quoted so far, suggests that there were a lot of speculations about what was discussed, but nobody actually knew the actual truth. But following that meeting, Umar ibn Saad then wrote a second letter to Ibn Ziyad, stating that the Imam has agreed to return and to either to Medina or to a border area, and if that was acceptable to Ibn Ziyad, that would be better for the community. Now please note that we discussed before that the Imam knew God's decree. He knew the time had come for the ultimate sacrifice. He knew this was the stage that he had been prepared throughout his life for. But he wanted to expose the enemy. He wanted to show the world that these people were motivated by worldly gains and therefore not prepared to compromise. So when Ibn Ziyad read the second letter, he was inclined to accept that proposal. Except that Shimr ibn Joshan said, "Will you accept this from someone who is nearby on your land? By God, if you allow Hussein to leave your dominion without obtaining his allegiance, he will be considered strong and powerful, and you will be viewed as weak and impotent." So on reflection, Ibn Ziyad agreed with Shimr's opinion and sent a third letter to Umar ibn Saad. And this stated, "If Hussein and his followers submit to my authority and surrender, then send them to me in peace. If they refuse, then engage them to kill." Shimr himself took this letter to Umar. And after reading that letter, Umar said, "By God, I think you influence Ibn Ziyad versus accepting my proposal and spoiled my efforts. Hussein alayhi salam would never submit, for he is endowed with a proud spirit and high self-esteem." Shimr then gave Umar ibn Saad an ultimatum. Either you carry out Ibn Ziyad's instructions or pass the control to me. And of course, Umar ibn Saad said, "You will not benefit from this intervention that you did. I will control the army, you control the foot soldiers." So tonight, the tradition is to read the Shahadat of Hazrat Hur. And on the night of Ashura, Hur was restless, pacing the floor, full of regret for placing the Imam in the dangerous position that he had. And now listen to this. Just as Imam Ali had told Umar ibn Saad, Umar's father rather, about the fact that he would be his son's murderer, Imam Ali had once said to Hur's father that your son will be my son's helper. In that night, Umar ibn Saad was sending for Hur repeatedly to know what his position was or his decision was. Time was running out. One colleague saw Hur in a state of restlessness and wrongly thought that perhaps Hur was afraid. And he said, "I know most soldiers are scared of fighting against the grandson of the Prophet. But you, Hur, I thought would be an exception." And Hur replied, "I'm not scared of facing death, but I shudder to think the fate on the day of resurrection if I fight the grandson of the Prophet." On the morning of Ashura, in Karbala, the Azan was called. And Hur went to Umar Saad and said, "I'm leaving you." And he headed towards the Imam. Two more riders followed him. And when he turned around to look at them, it was his son and his slave. And Hur said, "You didn't need to join me." And his son said, "Oh father, when you are heading towards heaven, you want us to leave us behind?" So all three then approached the camp. They could hear the humming of the prayer from the camps. Hur asked his son to tie him up so that he could go in and surrender and apologize to the Imam. As they approached the camp, Imam Hussein and Hazrat Abbas came out to meet them. Hur fell on his knees and begged with tears for forgiveness. And he said, "The least I can do for you is to lay my life before any of your companions or your family." The Imam was deeply moved by his words. He said, "Hur, I forgive you, and my God has forgiven you." The strength of character that you have displayed in rejecting the worldly gains was incredible. As the sun started to rise, the enemy battle drums were beating. Hur insisted on being the first one to go out to battle. Maybe he was thinking that as head of 1,000 men, he may be able to persuade, and he made a very emotional speech to the army. Shimr, the Maloon, realized that all will be lost if Hur could convince a quarter of the army towards Imam Hussein. And against the normal rules of battle, where it was a one-on-one, he suggested to Umar ibn Saad to go out for an all-out attack on Hur and his son and his slave. But those three were clearly outnumbered, hopelessly. And when Hur, badly injured, falling off from his horse, he called out for the Imam. The Imam rushed towards him, found him, lifted his head onto his lap, cleansed the blood from his eye, and looked at Hur. And Hur looked back. And Imam said to him, "May God bless you, Hur." And Hur breathed his last. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum. Can I have your attention for a minute, please? There's a Honda Accord parked right outside the gate over here, which is basically parked illegal, needs to be removed immediately. There's a navy blue Honda Accord parked right outside the gate, entrance gate. Please, that needs to be moved immediately. Thank you very much for your cooperation.